All right, welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect, thank you so much. Welcome here to the WWF Panda Hub Pavilion and also to those watching online. Very glad to have you for this event on how to build accountability to global forest pledges in an equitable and transparent manner. We are very excited to dig into what I hope can be an open and earnest discussion on this somewhat tricky and challenging topic of building accountability. So my name is Erin Matson. I am a senior consultant with Climate Focus, who is the coordinator of the Forest Declaration Assessment. And so that's my main work is coordinating our annual assessment of progress toward 2030 forest goals. So accountability, of course, is an essential part of achieving those 2030 forest goals. How do we drive progress toward actually halting deforestation globally, halting forest degradation, restoring degraded forest areas? So I'm honored to be joined today by speakers and panelists who represent government, civil society, and multilateral institutions, and they'll provide insights based on their experiences and knowledge on how we tackle this shared challenge. So I'm first going to provide a little bit of background and context on the state of forest goals before we hear opening remarks from one of our distinguished guests. And then I'll introduce our panelists for a discussion and Q&A with the audience. So please feel free to note down your questions so that you are ready when I turn to the audience. So as I mentioned, I am a coordinator of the Forest Declaration Assessment. We started as the New York Declaration on Forests Progress Assessment after the NYDF was announced at UN Climate Week in New York in 2014. And the goal at the time was, let's not let this pledge remain just a piece of paper, right? When the pledge was announced, there was no built-in accountability mechanism. And so we, along with a robust group of civil society organizations who work on forests, decided, we need to provide some level of accountability toward this pledge. So our goal is we enable accountability by releasing an annual report on the state of progress toward these forest pledges. And we hope that by elevating this information every year, aggregating it, communicating it, we keep the pledge alive, right? And bring and raise awareness globally through the media, through social media, through events like this, so that we can each hold the pledgers accountable in the way that we do best, depending on, if you work for an advocacy organization, civil society, if you're in government and you're talking to, your higher ups and saying, we need to, we need to keep to this pledge. Of course, after the Glasgow Leaders Declaration at COP26 in 2021, we decided to future-proof our name a little bit, so we're now the Forest Declaration Assessment, but we have the same basic theory of change, that by aggregating information and providing new insight from our 30 or so civil society organizations and research organizations in the coalition, that we can raise this awareness every year. So, unfortunately though, as we all probably are aware, globally we are not making as much progress toward this goal as we need to in order to be on track to halt and reverse deforestation and degradation by 2030. In 2023, 6.4 million hectares of forest globally were deforested. That includes 3.7 million hectares of tropical primary forests, which primary forests, as we all know, are irreplaceable. So we're 45% off track from the goal if you assume that from the beginning to the end of this decade we need to reach zero. We assume a linear trajectory. So we're 45% off track. Alongside deforestation, we also track degradation. In 2022, 62 million hectares of forest fell from a higher to a lower ecological integrity category. That's 10 times the area of deforestation. That's an area twice the size of Germany. So forest degradation also is a huge problem that needs to be tackled. Restoration is progressing, but not nearly at the scale needed. So I think that's enough doom and gloom. So let's talk about what's being done. And so for that, I am honored to welcome Brenda Mallory, who is the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality under the Biden administration, who will speak to the U.S. role in leadership and current and future efforts on building accountability and longevity in forest action. So over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Erin. Just a reminder that it's really important for us to have a little doom to motivate us, and so I think Erin's remarks are just an indicator of why it is that we're doing the work that we're doing and why it's so important for us to stay focused on that. First of all, let me just start off by thanking you for inviting me to join this, thanking NRDC for actually hosting the discussion. I think it's a really important discussion for us to have now. And one of the things to me that is so clear in this particular event, this particular COP, is just all of the conversations that are happening about the intersection between each of our areas of work. So I was just saying, I just left a speaking topic on freshwater. And when you think about sort of the freshwater protection efforts and the efforts that are specifically focused on forests, like those are so interconnected, as are so many of our issues. So I'm just grateful to be here. I mean, I think in some ways Erin already set up the doom. My doom remark is our world, and in particular our forests, are facing a set of mounting challenges that I think we are all aware, and the interrelated nature of those, including climate change and the rapid loss of biodiversity, is really front and center in the conversations that are happening. And in a very real way, forest conservation is part of the answer to many of the climate and biodiversity loss challenges that we face. Trees provide shade and cool buildings. They capture carbon, they reduce air pollution, and provide windbreaks for farms. And that's why over the past 4 years, President Biden and Vice President Harris have delivered on the most ambitious climate change and conservation agenda in our nation's history. The Biden-Harris administration sees the nature-based solutions, including forest conservation, as a critical tool to address the climate crisis. And just like renewable energy and electric vehicles, they need to be accelerated in its deployment in order for us to be successful. So our efforts to conserve lands and waters are a critical part to our overall efforts to combat the alarming decline in biodiversity that jeopardizes the economic and food systems that sustain us. Just this week, President Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and continuing to build on his own historic conservation legacy. In his first days in office, President Biden set a bold goal of conserving at least 30% of our nation's lands and waters by 2030. And countries around the world have adopted the same goal. And so at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, the United States joined 144 other countries in a commitment to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. To advance these ambitious goals, we launched what we call the America the Beautiful initiative, which is advancing locally led, community designed, and partnership driven conservation work across the United States. And I think that's really, in our minds, very key, because it's the kinds of activities that we have been promoting and financing over the course of the last 4 years are things that the community really saw as important, being a really strategic part of their own vision for themselves, and I think has an enduring quality about them for that reason. So thanks to the historic investments generated through two critical domestic legislative successes, the President's bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States has invested billions of dollars in conservation and in addressing climate change. And to date, the President has conserved more than 45 million acres of lands and waters through really this ground-up approach that I was describing that really prioritizes community leadership. We've also taken kind of multiple steps to protect the forests in the United States. That includes restoring protections for some of our nation's most cherished places, like the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, the world's largest intact temperate rainforest. And on Earth Day in 2022, President Biden issued an executive order on strengthening our nation's forests, including by safeguarding mature and old growth forests on federal lands, supporting reforestation partnerships, and advancing nature-based solutions more broadly. Earlier this year, we announced the conservation of nearly 335,000 acres of forest lands across the nation, made possible by our state partnerships and funding from the President's Inflation Reduction Act. So we've done a lot so far, and there's more work that is necessary. We've also protected forests and communities by removing hazardous fuels from nearly 18 million acres of land. And I think that in particular, in a time when wildfires are so prevalent in our country at rates that are very different than we've seen in the past, like there's a lot of concern about making sure you're doing the right balance in addressing the kind of fuel hazards while also preserving the integrity of the forest. And we are showing the world that it's possible to create economic opportunity while advancing climate solutions. As part of President Biden's landmark American Climate Corps program, we launched a Forest Corps program that's training young people in nature-based solutions and giving them foundational skills for careers in climate mitigation, conservation, reforestation, and resource management. And we've made it an important progress across the United States. Our commitment to reverse deforestation, and there's more work that is necessary. So, although we've just had what we consider a consequential election outcome that, from the perspective of those of us who are very focused on climate and environmental protection, was disappointing. I think one of the things that has been so invigorating as I've been here and talking to so many people about the work that's going on all across the country is that the work goes on. And so now it's really time for our partners and both global and domestic, to come together and lead states and cities, tribes and businesses and non-governmental organizations are stepping forward and advancing the work, much of which is already underway. And so I look forward to seeing the way in which these partnerships continue to grow and are forged ahead. So with that, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's wonderful to hear that list of domestic accomplishments over the last 4 years. Very heartening to hear, and especially how you spoke about the durability of that when it's locally led, right? When so many things are demanded by the community, demanded by, from the bottom up, it speaks to how those things will be sustained in the long term because they serve the people, right? And that's the ultimate goal. And I also appreciated your highlight of President Biden's unprecedented visit to the Amazon and show of support and long-term support for Amazon conservation as a demonstration of international accountability, right? Accountability to forest pledges at the international level and not just with domestic work. So I understand that you do have to leave momentarily, so whenever you do, please feel free to step out, and thank you again for joining us today. I'm now pleased to turn to our panel discussion and introduce our esteemed panelists. So these include Jennifer Skeen, who is the Global Northern Forest Policy Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. Welcome. Moradeke Adelkan. The emphasis, I was trying to make sure I got it right the first time. Moradeke Adelkan, who is Minister Counselor of the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. And Leticia Guimaraes, who is Global Lead for Carbon Markets at the UN Development Program, UNDP. Thank you all so much for being here. So I hope, as I mentioned earlier, that we can have a free-flowing and open conversation today. So maybe even start to get into some tough or contentious angles of this discussion. So in that spirit, please feel free to interrupt me if needed, to respond to your fellow panelists directly. And also when we turn to the audience for Q&A, please feel free to ask the tough questions. I know that we are ready to receive them. But first, I would like to invite each of you to please give an opening statement. First of all, how do you define accountability from your perspective and in your work? I mean, accountability is sometimes a scary topic. No one likes to be held accountable. It's not pleasant. But we do recognize that it is an important part of making progress toward the forest goals. But we also don't always know exactly what it should look like, right? So what do you think equitable accountability to forest pledges should look like? Or put another way, what is your working definition of accountability?
Yep. Do you want to start?
Moradeke, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Moradeke Adelekon. I'm a career diplomat with the Nigerian Foreign Service, and I also handle environmental issues at the ministry. And thank you so much, NRDC, for having me. So I'm going to engage in a little exercise with the members of the audience. I'm going to ask you to please turn to my right-hand side, which is your left. Please look at the picture on the wall. I'm sure we can see the green, the beauty. And then slightly please stand back. There is a picture at the back that says, now is the time to act. So with our pictures in mind, I will start my remarks. So once again, thank you for having me here today to talk about this tropical topic of accountability and equity. Delivering the pledge to halt and reverse forest loss and degradation by 2030 enshrined in the first Global Stockstake and the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use is an urgent priority, both for climate and biodiversity. As decision makers, we know that our forests are fundamental to improving and safeguarding local livelihood, as well as protecting the global climate. So how can we explain that we have so far failed to unite in the implementation of our shared ambition for forest preservation? Why have forest discussion been limited solely to deforestation and degradation of tropical forests in the global south, while we fail to address the destructive forest practices in the global north? Countries in our region are increasingly concerned that delivering on our global ambition is held back by foundational inequities in our forest policy structures, grounded in a lack of unified responsibilities and accountability between developed and developing countries. Solutions for delivering on the commitment to halt and reverse forest degradation along deforestation must be inclusive of both tropical and non-tropical forests. Progress everywhere depends on a level playing field. Boreal and temperate forests in the global north are among the most carbon-dense, ecologically vital ecosystem in the world. However, primary and old-growth forests continue to be clear-cut at alarming rates in the global north. But countries in the global north don't count this as deforestation. And increasingly, they are trying to avoid it being considered forest degradation as well. For years, countries in the global north seem to have successfully limited the forest discussion solely to deforestation and degradation of tropical forests in the global south. This double standard places an additional burden on the Global South, preventing us from addressing this problem as true partners. It prevents developing unified global solutions and supply chains. It undermines the spirit of partnership and trust that we need to work together. The dynamic must urgently change. That is why I'm extremely proud that African nations have reached a consensus to support the development of a global forest equity framework as a means of driving global progress and promoting greater alignment between forest protection standard across tropical, temperate, and boreal forests. Our continent as a whole seeks to secure the development of enhanced and common reporting, monitoring, and definitions to ensure global commitment to arts and reverse degradation and are implemented to the same standard within and outside the tropics. We need to drive cooperation and collaboration across all forests. West Africa is providing leadership, but we need the wealthiest nations to match and exceed it. We need all climate negotiators to rally behind the development of an equity framework. And we need to ensure that this framework is adopted by the next meeting of the Climate Conference of the Parties in 2025 to ensure that we can all meet our 2030 global forest commitment on time. Let us all, as partners, put our effort where our mouth is. The world can no longer wait. I thank you all.
Thank you, Moradeke. Jen, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you so much. Accountability, to your question about what accountability means, it really is about being answerable to a constituency for a particular outcome. And in this case, when it comes to forests, that constituency is the global community, and that outcome is a scientifically robust implementation of the commitments to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. And thinking about the term accountability, it's so powerful because it captures many different things. Accountability entails transparency. It implies due diligence. It implies equity, to the point that Moradeke was just making. So accountability is sort of this messenger RNA, if you will, that transcribes the DNA of commitments into a realized reality. And without it, you're not going to have the ability to really bring to life that blueprint. And unfortunately, when it comes to our forest policy structures, there is a real accountability crisis, which is why we've had, as Erin mentioned, commitment after commitment on forests, unfortunately, fail, and why the outcomes in the Forest Declaration Assessment remain so bleak. Not to bring it back to the doom and gloom. One of the biggest problems, just to build a little bit on what Moradeke already talked about, is that accountability on forests has little meaning in half the globe. Built into this is a forest policy structure that there's an assumption that there's no scrutiny and therefore no needed accountability for countries in the global north. So thinking about countries like Canada, Sweden, Australia, Estonia, this accountability is really displaced by myths that just assume that countries are elevated in the global north, be above the need for accountability, and that there is just abject immunity to any kind of real criticism. One exception that I want to just point to is that the U.S., as Chair Mallory mentioned, is under the Biden administration, there has been unprecedented attention to the importance of old growth and mature forests in the United States. And that is a huge, huge step forward of recognizing this dynamic that we need to be protecting those very critical carbon-dense, biodiverse ecosystems. So very much grateful for the Biden administration's efforts on that front. But for a very long time and across much of the global north, we have a system where a clear-cut forest in a country like Canada isn't even considered deforestation under global policy. We have this very warped legal fiction that a clear-cut is somehow still deemed a forest. So the idea that you haven't actually converted a forest into an entirely different land use, like a cattle ranch or a palm oil plantation, it still has the potential to one day return as a forest and feed, once again, timber supply. So the idea that you can be standing in the middle of a clear cut, there is no canopy between your face and the sun, stumps everywhere, and somehow you're in this reality where that is considered a forest. And scientifically, it's really nonsensical and is very harmful to building that accountability. So on paper, we have countries that are really inculpable, and that's how many global north countries comport themselves when it comes to accountability, as really outside the system. And one of the big points of progress in recent years has been the fact that forest degradation was included in the 2030 forest targets under the global stocktake. So we are increasingly having rules that clearly consider the impact of clear-cut logging on primary old growth and mature forests. But as these new standards are really closing in, we're also seeing increased pushback from countries in the global north. So for example, NRDC has been working very closely with leading legislators at the state level in the United States to advance procurement legislation that would ensure that state purchases are real. Just to wrap up, this, as Moradeke was saying, this lack of accountability for the global north really puts the whole process at risk, because we need, as she said, a level playing field. We need something where there's true partnerships, where the standards are global and can really foster transformative change. So as we're thinking about delivering on those 2030 commitments, we really need to start thinking about building equity in our accountability systems, working from common standards, common definitions, common monitoring and reporting practices to really position the world finally to deliver on the targets that it's set.
Thank you so much, Jen. Leticia, what do you think?
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm so pleased to hear the panelists before me. There is so much that has been already said, and we are so well aligned that it's difficult to complement. It seems rehearsed, but the idea of global accountability, it's really a key point here. I think it's very interesting that when it comes to results, mitigation, outcomes, and results, everyone wants to claim it. But when it comes to accountability for losses, not that many people will raise their hands. So this is an issue for countries and globally as well. I think the differentiated treatment that we still have under this convention, it's clear. When it comes to developed countries, Annex 1 countries, there are natural disturbances that are considered. So the emissions that are related to wildfires and natural disasters are not accounted for. So there is no accountability for those. Unfortunately, for developing countries that are seeing more and more the effects of climate change with more fires, with more natural disturbances, they don't have the prerogative of using the same accounting rubric to determine that these have been caused by issues that go beyond their control. And I think this is a key point that must be reconsidered here. We understand that the land sector in general, but in particular forests, are a key component of the climate solution. But we cannot never forget that fossil fuels are the key cause, and without tackling the key cause, forests will suffer. There is nothing that countries that hold forests can do. It will still be a loss. And I think a clear example of this is what we saw in my home country, even though I don't represent Brazil, but you can see that there were a lot of changes in policies. The new administration under Lula has invested a lot of resources. The global community came around. A lot of pledges were made. The Amazon Fund is back. Deforestation decreased sharply, but still this year we saw a lot of uncontrollable fires in a scale that is unprecedented. So there is no way that you can be prepared for something that you never saw before. And then it's also key to understand how do you share responsibilities when it comes to this type of global disasters. I think more and more here in this convention we are understanding that mitigation on its own is not sufficient, that we need adaptation, and we need also loss and damage for the disasters that are happening with great consequences in the global south. But it's still, as it was mentioned by everyone before me, when it comes to taking up the responsibilities for their own forest sector, we don't see as much coming from the global north. So I think it's about time that we see the example and the leadership coming from these countries that actually hold technology and lessons to deal with wildfires. We know that Canada has experienced this for many, many years. The same goes for Portugal and France, and some of these lessons in terms of managing the forest stock to prevent these fires and even in combating fire itself when it happens needs to be shared with the global south, so as a global community we can be better placed to tackle this challenge. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Chair Mallory, for joining us. Good luck with your later events. So, such great opening remarks. Maradike, I was struck by, you can't have equitable accountability if the starting point of the Forest Pledge itself is inequitable. How do we overcome that challenge, right, in terms of the original framing of what is intended to be achieved? I would love you to speak to that, but first I also just want to pull out what I heard a little bit from the other two points as well. Jen, I found it really interesting how accountability is the mechanism through which implementation and action occurs. If you don't have accountability, then there is no driver for action, right? So if the accountability mechanism is not in place, the pledge is dead on arrival, right? So that was very interesting. And then Leticia, I appreciated how you pointed out that, the accounting frameworks which enable accountability, that's the transparency, that's the vehicle for data and transparency that you can use to hold folks accountable. If that does not account for the changing situation under climate change, where something that is natural, forest fires are not historically not naturally occurring in the tropics, but they sure are now. And if the carbon accounting framework doesn't account for that change, then we're not in an equitable situation. So that was very interesting. So these are all barriers that you've identified for ensuring accountability. And as you mentioned, Jen, the 2030 forest goals are now embedded in the global stock take as of last year. That is an accountability mechanism for the Paris Agreement. So what do you see as the biggest barriers to implementation of accountability mechanisms, existing accountability mechanisms, and how can they be addressed? How can we address some of these barriers that you all have mentioned? Please, Maradike.
Thank you once again. First, I would like to thank Jennifer and Leticia because they actually gave a summary of the reality of what we're dealing with in the Global South. When there is inequality in tackling any issue, definitely there won't be good results. When the Global North do not see deforestation and forest degradation as a problem for them, naturally, the willpower to push the ideas for the Global South is going to be more or less, if they are not doing their part, why should we do our part? But unfortunately, we are the ones suffering a lot. As I speak to you, in Nigeria, we've lost, if I'm not exaggerating, more than 60% of our forest floor. It's that bad. We're really dealing with people's livelihood are on the risks. And we are willing to walk our talk. For instance, in Nigeria, we're part of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and Planet. And what are we doing? We've made a pledge, a 30 by 30 pledge, which is by 2030, 30% of our land our inland waters and our ocean will be preserved for ecological purpose to ensure that similarly extinct species are reserved. We also try to do reforestation of some of our forest lost. But the technology to maintain this, to maintain all these ambitions that we have, and then the finance is not there. So we are calling on the Global North. We're not just asking you to please walk your talk. We also need the commitment. There is a commitment to give developing countries 20 billion by 2025. When are we getting this money? We're not asking for the money because we are not willing to do the work. We have the work to do. We have our plans. In Nigeria, in addition to the 30-30 plan that we have, we're also looking forward to collaborate with Brazil. Brazil has the Amazon forest, and we know they have whatever they've done to preserve the Amazon forest, we're willing to learn. We're also working with some other countries of the Central Africa, where we have the Congo Basin. So these are knowledge that we are willing to listen to, adapt them to our country to ensure that we recover and restore our forest. But the technological know-how, say for instance, there are some species that we can replant, but we do not have the knowledge, the adequate knowledge and the adequate resources to replant these trees, and also maybe alternative livelihood for our people living within this forest. So this, for us, the barriers is we need to come together, come at the table, sit together, reevaluate what are the challenges, reevaluate what do we think the solutions should be. And all hands being on deck, we must tackle it together. There should be no discrimination. There should be no, this goes for inequity is completely unacceptable. Animal farms should not be practiced in this day and time. So we're calling on the Global North to please ensure they also give accounts of what they are doing. Partner with us, give us the technological know-how that we need to in capacity training, and also the commitment for the finance should please be donated as has been previously pledged. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think that's really great to understand that it's a partnership, right? It needs to be a global, equitable partnership. It can't be adversarial. We're all on the same team. So let's support each other in what we each need. Thank you for those points. If you'd like to speak to this, Letitia, please.
No, I was just thinking as we were saying that if it's global accountability, it should be everyone's accountability as well. I've been working on forests for 20 years, and sometimes you go to these events and everyone is eating meat, like beef. And I'm like, do you know where this has been sourced? Because this could be sourced from a deforestation area. When you go to the supermarkets, are you looking for potential products that are deforestation free? Those already exist. Oftentimes, they come with an additional cost. Of course, it's not everyone, so there is an equity issue there as well. But most of us would be able to afford a little more to make sure that our own products are not connected with deforestation. Is this going to stop forests from being degraded and destroyed everywhere? No. But until we take our own responsibility within our supply chains and the products that we consume and the things that we buy, I think it will be a lost effort at the same time. We need to demand from our governments that they do the right things, that they do the sustainable procurement. I think that's key. In Brazil, this was something that was done a while ago in terms of making sure that nothing was connected to deforestation in public procurement, but also making sure that the meals are coming from smallholders, from sustainable agriculture programs, because there is this component as well, right? If you give the priority of procurement, even when you don't give a higher price, you're creating this incentive further down the line for those initiatives to happen. So I think, as a society, there is a lot in terms of political will, but there is also a lot that we can do as citizens. So I just wanted to make sure that we mark this point as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it is a great analogy as well for this sense of how countries and in the international level they should be held accountable. I mean, as long as we're not holding ourselves accountable to our values, do we expect change to happen? At the same time, as long as we don't hold our own governments, especially those of us who are in more privileged positions in terms of, living in global north countries who are not yet holding their weight, how are we holding our own governments accountable so that they deliver on their promises and support other countries? It's a great point. Jen, do you want to speak to this barriers question, or I have a little bit of a different question for you?
I can weave them together. So
my question for you, and of course for all the panelists, is, where have you seen significant examples of progress on forest conservation, protection, and restoration? And what lessons can that provide in terms of how that implementation or progress was made and how accountability played a role?
Yeah, so I mean, Leticia spoke to this a little bit in terms of actually engaging with smallholders on the ground and the people who are there, seeing the impacts, living with the impacts, and able to sort of build a well-working, enduring, sustainable economy. And this is why the leadership of Nigeria has been so important on calling for a global forest equity framework, is because it finally would create the language and create the platforms for countries to be actually singing from the same song sheet in terms of what these impacts actually mean, and in terms of what monitoring needs to happen, what is actually happening in those supply chains, not just in the South. And in fact, sort of counterintuitively, the biggest data gaps, as you know from the FDA's work building degradation into the report, the biggest data gaps are in the global North, because they're not looking at what is actually happening on the ground. Again, there's this assumption of complete inculpability, and then making sure that the reporting is happening in a very even way. So the leadership that Nigeria is really showing on those three pillars, and then of course the finance and resources piece, has been key. But that also, where I've really seen the most progress when it comes to forest protection has been on the ground from indigenous peoples and local communities. Studies are very, very clear and unequivocal that where indigenous rights are strongest, biodiversity and carbon values of the land are best protected, are the highest. And so where we've seen the greatest progress in places like Canada, in places like the United States, are those that are championed, designed, and led by indigenous peoples. And this really illustrates, getting back to that whole supply chain transparency piece, how divorced global policy and the narratives there can be from the reality on the ground. So global policy may say that things are fine in Sweden, but the Sami are highlighting declines in their reindeer health. Canada claims sustainable forest management, but Eagle Lake First Nation sees degradation firsthand. So we need to do more to really peel away that veil between what's actually happening on the ground and the leadership that is being shown there, and how these things are discussed and designed at a global scale, and really building as well indigenous voices and indigenous knowledge into policymaking, because that's where the greatest solutions have really been.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, just speaking briefly to that data gap point, that we've struggled with the Forest Declaration Assessment on measuring degradation and having access to globally comparable data sets on global North forest degradation. There's very few. The Forest Landscape Integrity Index is what we use, that is the best proxy right now, but there's data. It's just not through the traditional channels that we look at, right? So it's not necessarily globally comparable, but people on the ground know what's going on. And if indigenous peoples and local communities have an avenue to share that, that can be so important to building transparency, equity, and then therefore accountability, right? I know we have a lot more that we want to talk about. I do want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, if you could, raise your hand, and then if you could, please introduce yourself with your name, your affiliation, and then mention if you have a specific panelist you'd like to answer the question.
Hi, my name is G. Wilson. I'm a student researcher from Indiana University focusing on climate litigation this week. I was specifically curious about whether any of you think there's an opportunity for, you were talking a little bit more about holding governments accountable, and especially like in the US, that's going to become increasingly important in the next 4 years. Is there an opportunity for the courts to hold a place to hold governments accountable in forest policy, in your guys' opinion? And if so, is that coming from more global definitions of what forest degradation and deforestation is, and just your thoughts on that generally. Thank you.
I don't know if we're collecting more questions, but this is a question that I like so much, and I've been looking at this a lot now. So actually, INTOSAI, which is the international group of, I don't know how to translate this, I'm sorry, but it's like the courts that hold governments accountable for their investments as public budget. It was on this last presidency, so they circulate the responsibilities, but on this one they were looking at how these audit mechanisms in countries that usually look at, okay, did you implement your budget according to what it was said on legislation, how they can hold countries accountable for the Paris Agreement goals. Because of course, when it comes to bringing these international treaties, this goes through legislation, and once it becomes legislation, it's a government obligation to implement. Governments are developing their own sectoral policies, which are the basis for the NDCs. So how can the audit courts hold the governments accountable for having in place sufficient budget to meet their own targets? And this is a movement that for me, 20 years ago when I started following these discussions, I never imagined that it would happen. Of course, there is a lot of issues with the source of data. So some of the discussions that they were holding, they were using independent data that they could find that would be comparable to do this type of exercise. But of course, countries are doing their nationally determined contributions on the basis of their own national greenhouse gas inventories. So then you would seek for compliance using data that's different from the basis of the target itself. So there is an issue there, but just the movement from these, national organizations that audit their own countries in trying to seek methodologies and systems to better identify in budgets if there is the appropriate allocation to meet these targets. I feel it's a very important movement in the right direction.
Yeah, that was a great question. And I think that there's a couple of concrete areas, at least that are on my radar, though, definitely welcome sort of new legal minds thinking about these problems and coming in to really bring new perspectives. So one is, of course, around indigenous rights and the rights of communities. So we're seeing impacts on the ground that are very much being felt by those on the front lines around loss of their forests, loss of their cultural resources, and as well as land displacement. And so there's already, in case law in places, particularly like Canada, has had a number of very important recent cases in the last few years establishing rights of indigenous peoples on their land, cumulative impacts, and what kinds of harms and liabilities fall from those. The second area is around consumer protection, because again, a lot of the narratives that are coming out of the global north then translate to companies, which is a whole other accountability area to dig into. But companies are making claims about the sustainability of their products and really propagating these false realities that are not actually based in truth. We're seeing this with companies like Procter & Gamble in the United States, who are claiming that their products like Charmin toilet paper are sustainable and avoiding these forest impacts, but they're being sourced from primary and old growth boreal forests, critical caribou habitat. And then the third area, just to bring it back to sort of the global level, is around this idea of transboundary harm. And we often think about this in the fossil fuel perspective, but there are also emissions that are coming from the forestry sector, tremendous emissions. In fact, emissions in Canada from forestry account for more than 10% of the country's footprint. It's enormous. And so there's been a lot of thinking at the international level and a lot of action to really build accountability around transboundary harms. So I think this could equally be applicable to the emissions and other impacts that are coming from in the forest sector.
Thank you. That's a very fruitful question. Does anyone else have a question? I think it's really interesting how you both brought up the issue of data integrity and availability and comparability as it's easy to put out data that is not verified or verifiable. So how do we bridge that gap with corporate accountability, but also it could apply in other sectors as well. And then, yeah, that mismatch between national data and internationally comparable data sets comes up a lot in this discussion, because if we're not talking about the same facts and figures and the same definitions, how can we be, how can we get to an agreement, right? Any other questions from the audience? All right, great, because I have a lot, so. Oh, one more? Oh, please, go ahead.
I'm curious if any of you, including our moderator, uses AI and AI capabilities. I mean, in the new capabilities that are coming up for doing your work, and do you see that helps? I mean, professional databases that are managed or accessed through AI, and a lot of other options that AI gives us.
Yeah, AI in terms of building, sort of managing large amounts of data, analyzing, increasing transparency, that kind of application. Is anyone using that?
At UNDP, we are exploring the options that AI offer with digital MRV, because one of the key issues in some of the projects that we have, in particular when it involves people, is that you have this factor of the incentive to continue to provide data over time. Unfortunately, many of these mechanisms work a lot with carbon markets. The incentive comes only after you prove, a while after, that you've done what you've done. And in contexts where you're living day by day, if you tell a landowner, okay, you have this, this instrument that you need to track and do what you do, and in 2 or 3 years' time, I'll come back with some money for you for the results that you achieved. It becomes very difficult to keep momentum and continue with the project. So we are exploring it, but we are very concerned at the same time about detaching from reality, because this human component of the landowners, as it was said by Jennifer before, of being a key part of the process, of being integrated into the data collection, in understanding what this data means, why it's being collected, how important it is, and showing that they have a key role not only in the activity but also in this monitoring part is also essential. So we are exploring AI, but at the same time trying to ensure that this doesn't detach too much from the actual reality on the ground.
Yeah, that's a great point. You have to have a stake in the whole process and understand the whole process in order for it to feel real, right? And be mutually or a reinforcing kind of motivator. Let's see. We might have time for one more question. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, taking from you guys, the audience. So you've lost your chance. I'd like to come back to this question of how corporate accountability plays in with what we've mostly been talking about as sort of government and international accountability. I wonder if anyone can speak to, how can corporate accountability be ensured, or how can government and corporate accountability be mutually reinforcing? What do you think is the relationship there?
Okay, in my own opinion, I think it's very important the government involve the private sector. There is this public-private partnership. It's very important. It's the key. Because sometimes the private sector are not they probably don't have the full picture on ground of the reality of what's going on. So for me, it's important that for every regulation, specifically on climate change, the private sector should be brought on board. Companies that deals with end products of the forest of trees should be made to understand the more you do this, ABC is the consequence. So you have the money, you have the resources to look for alternative sources rather than going to the forest to cut down the trees, rather than keep encouraging illegal logging and other forest crime. And there also should be regulations, legislative acts, so that when people violate these rules, there should be penalties and consequences, and not just a slap on the wrist penalties. We all know private sectors and their profit-making ventures. So maybe when something is done as a deterrent against their profit-making, it might sound a little bit drastic, but with such deterrent, I'm sure they will fall in line and do the right thing. That's what I think it's important. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I can just say to that really quickly. So, I mean, corporate accountability and government accountability really go hand in hand. One supports the other, and similarly, in those places where there's insufficient accountability, they reinforce each other, and they foster these false narratives jointly. One thing that is very important to note is that corporate accountability cannot be sort of done in the absence of government regulation. Systems like third-party certifications have a role to play, but they cannot be the sole solution. And we've been seeing, in the absence of government regulations, a race to the bottom of industry-led certification programs. So, you have some genuinely credible systems like FSC, but then you also have some very sort of industry-driven systems like SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative. And without having those government standards at play, there's an increasing watering down and a race to the bottom of sort of what companies are holding themselves to and considering sustainable. The one other thing I'll say on the corporate accountability side is it does create all sorts of new levers for affecting change and building that accountability, because you have economic accountability that you don't necessarily have, at least not quite as directly in the government space. So we're seeing a lot of progress. The other area of progress has been from the financial sector. They have been real champions of initiatives like the Trees Act in New York and the EU deforestation regulation, because they recognize that there is risk to their shareholders and to their investments in failing to address these impacts. So we've seen successful shareholder resolutions against companies like Procter & Gamble, against companies like the Home Depot, that are really calling on them to actually meaningfully address and report on what they can do to address the impacts that they're having on the ground.
Great. Thank you so much. So we just have a couple minutes left. What I'm hearing here is that regulation is one of the main mechanisms of relationship between corporate and government accountability. This has been extremely interesting. I wish we could go all day. We can't. So what I would love to ask is if each of our panelists could give us one next step that needs to be taken in order to build equitable and transparent accountability for forest pledges. And I will start with you, Leticia.
We need to be united for our forests. I think this was an initiative that was launched by Brazil at the last COP. I think they will take to Belém next year. And this should be, as it was said by Moradek, I'm sorry, something that encompasses all countries. So let's be united for our forests.
I'm going to build on what she just said. I think it's very important. Equity is a key. Transparency and accountability. When we're transparent, we'll come together, report what is at loss, rejuvenate what we can do to rebuild our forests and also our biodiversity, and the commitment to do this will safeguard our future. Thank you.
I think the main thing would be, speaking to what Moradeke was talking about earlier, is supporting and helping to affect the global forest equity framework that Nigeria is championing. This has a real potential to cut through the noise and to really unravel the myths that have been hindering progress for such a very long time. So I think that looking at that as sort of an overarching North Star for where the international community can go to really start to actually work together as partners, that is absolutely critical, particularly over the next year.
That's great. Yeah, we need to be a united front. We're all a team. We need to be transparent and proactively reporting what we're doing, and we need to establish a framework that levels the playing field. Let's do it. All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, panelists. I really appreciate the discussion.